introductions. And just to let our reporters who are joining us know, we were just over in Mississippi talking about drinking water and sort of how climate induced catastrophes expose historic injustices and systemic racism and how that plays out there. We're going to now head over to the western part of the US and talk about climate-fueled changes like wildfire, drought, heat waves, things like that, and how they are impacting a critical part of our country, which is the ag workers that keep food coming out of those parts of the world, and work going on to protect ag worker health and look at where those issues are going to arise in the future even more. So we're really excited to have Michael Mendez and Devin Cardenas here. And to let you know who they are, Michael is assistant professor of environmental planning and policy at the University of California, Irvine. He's an Andrew Carnegie Fellow and a visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He most recently served as the inaugural James and Mary Pinchot Family Fellow in Sustainable Studies and Associate Research Scientist at the Yale School of the Environment. He has more than a decade of senior level experience in public and private sectors where he's consulted and engaged in policymaking process. This included working for the California State Legislature, a member of the California State Mining and Geology Board, and vice chair of the Sacramento City Planning Commission. Michael has served as the co-author of the U.S. Global Change Research Program study on climate vulnerability and social science perspectives. And he is also author of an award-winning book called Climate Change from the Streets, which was published by Yale University Press. His current work focuses on climate-induced disasters and social vulnerability, and is being supported by a National Science Foundation Early Career Faculty Award. So we are really excited to have Michael here. Davin is Director of Organizing for North Bay Jobs with Justice, a grassroots coalition of more than 30 labor and community organizations in Sonoma, Napa, and Marin counties. He has lived in Sonoma County since 1999 and been a community organizer for over 18 years, organizing immigrant and faith-based communities for social, ecological, and economic justice. He graduated from Sonoma State University with a BA in Liberal Studies and jumped right into his activist work as the first day labor organizer in the town of Grattan, California, at the Day Labor Center, where he organized undocumented workers into a labor collective. Davin believes that solutions abound when we listen to the land and listen to the workers. And we are really excited to have you as well. So I think we're going to turn it over to Michael first. And Davin, I'll also make you a co-host in case you have slides to share. And after we've heard from you, we'll open the floor for questions.
Great. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Adam, for inviting us to this very innovative and much needed workshop. And how do we center these stories from marginalized communities that are empowering themselves to address climate-induced disasters. I'm familiar with some of you on this. I read many of your works and articles, so it's a pleasure to see you online and your faces behind some of the bylines. So thank you for that opportunity. So today I'm going to be talking about some of my new research on climate-induced disasters, particularly to undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. Some of you may know my original work from, as Adam mentioned, Climate Change from the Streets. Well, in this book, it chronicles and contributes to the field of urban and environmental policy and studies by highlighting how social movements and other actors are influencing the policymaking process to ensure equitable climate change solutions in low-income communities of color throughout the United States and globally. And it was the first book to focus on California's global influence from people of color and environmental justice perspective. So building on this multi-scalar approach, my research agenda evolves now from policymaking around climate change pollution mitigation, that is perspective, to adapting socially vulnerable populations that from the immediate impacts of climate change. This shift in focus is necessary because the impacts are happening sooner than projected and creating a public health emergency, particularly for the most disempowered and voiceless populations, such as undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. So this research addresses populations that are rendered invisible during disasters. For example, during recent fires, the economic impact of smoke taint is estimated to have cost the California wine industry $3.7 billion. Smoke taint occurs when smoke and ash permeate the skin of grapes, which can affect the taste and smell of wine. However, too much concern is often placed on the impacts to the wine industry, but not on the farm workers that are harvesting grapes during wildfire events and how their lungs are also being tainted. They are not provided with adequate occupational health and safety protections, let alone hazard pay or federal disaster funds to work in mandatory evacuation zones considered hazardous to the general population. Making these inequities visible is important because in California, as many of you know, we are experiencing a major climate change crisis. In the last several years, millions of people have been impacted by multiple compounding disasters such as wildfires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, and of course, the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These compounding of disasters have cascading health, social, and economic impacts. And due to the existing structural inequality, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. In essence, wildfires in California are not isolated disasters. They now often compound with other hazards and comorbidities, or what is called a syndemic in the field of public health. So now more than ever, it's crucial to understand how these events amplify existing inequalities and how to lessen the resulting harms, particularly in the context of extreme wildfire impacts to undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. While this case study is based on impacts to California's most marginalized and stigmatized populations, it has global implications. California's wildfire problems are now affecting sensitive populations around the world. For example, in 2020, smoke from multiple extreme wildfire events reached not only New York State, but also Western Europe. Given their social status, undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants are particularly vulnerable to disasters such as wildfire and require special consideration and disaster planning. They are disproportionately affected by racial discrimination, exploitation, economic hardships, less English and Spanish proficiency, and fear deportation in their everyday lives, or what we call their pre-disaster marginalized status. And it's important to understand that if you really want to tackle disaster risk reduction, it starts with the social integration of migrants before disaster, including them in our social safety net, in our unemployment, or in our healthcare, in our disaster, federal disaster relief aid, which many of them are excluded because of their immigration status. So really acknowledging that disasters only exacerbate existing inequalities. And this population often experiences a hyper form of marginalization because they're not integrated into our social safety net or our society in general. Our research on wildfires in California's Ventura, Santa Barbara, and now Sonoma counties, which I work with Davin's group, North Bay Jobs with Justice, has been developed in a co-productionist or community-based participatory research framework, where migrant rights and environmental justice groups that lived and worked during the wildfire disasters are my co-authors. They are vital contributors to the research design, data collection, and analysis. They were also key in presenting study findings to multiple public policy audiences at the local, state, national, and even international levels, including the United Nations Migration Agency, at the state level, the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, at the federal level, FEMA, and the National Oceanic Atmospheric Association. Moreover, this co-productionist framework shows that undocumented migrants are rendered invisible in the context of public policy by systemic racism and cultural norms regarding U.S. citizenship and who is considered a worthy disaster victim. Our research highlights how political choices are intentionally being made that prioritize some lives over others. Climate change is making wildfire season longer and more severe, as many of you have reported. Moreover, 17 of the 20 largest wildfires by acreage in California have occurred since the year 2000. In Sonoma County, where Davin works, an epicenter for wildfires, and is the bastion of California's high-end wine industry, has suffered from multiple years of extreme wildfire events that have been ranked in the top 5 and top 20 for the most destructive and deadly wildfires in California's history. Cumulatively, they have burned over 1 million acres, destroyed more than 12,000 structures, and caused 34 deaths. While climate scientists expect wildfires to become more frequent and severe, it's important to explore how some people and communities are more affected by these events than others. While many of California's fire-prone regions are largely populated by higher income groups, they also include hundreds of thousands of low-income individuals who lack the resources to prepare or recover from fire. These numbers will likely surge according to the California 4th Climate Change Assessment Report, which projects that the state's wildfire burn area will increase by 77% by the end of the century. The state of California, however, does not have a comprehensive analysis of wildfire as it relates to social vulnerability or demographic data. Outcomes occurring during and after wildfires have major environmental justice implications, in that certain populations, due to socioeconomic status, must live with a disproportionate share of environmental impacts and suffer the related public health and quality of life burdens. Moreover, in our research, we investigate how human identities such as gender, class, race, indigeneity, and immigration status intersect with wildfire disaster. Sonoma County, which you'll hear more from Davin, has been an epicenter for extreme wildfires and environmental injustice in the state. Media outlets, governments, and scholars across the country, however, have largely focused reports on the loss of coastal and hillside mansions that impacts wealthy homeowners and farmers. The Sonoma fires, however, not only destroyed expensive property and crops, but it also endangered the health and livelihood of thousands of undocumented migrants. In this case study, I highlight the forms of discrimination and unsafe labor conditions faced by undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants during wildfires. As one resident of the region told me, undocumented migrants are the invisible population living and working behind the Bugnabilia curtain. They are struggling to survive in a region of wealth and prosperity. This idiom references the fast-growing evergreen vine with an explosive magenta color that adorns the gates of mansions and farms for added privacy. California is home to an estimated 2.6 million undocumented migrants, many whom are farm workers or employed in service jobs such as housekeeping and landscaping. In Sonoma County, undocumented individuals are estimated to account for 8% of the population, or more than 38,000 people. Governments in California in particular overlook the needs of Indigenous farm workers and migrant families in developing disaster plans. Sonoma County is home to a growing Indigenous Mexican population. It is estimated that over 12,000 Indigenous people from Mexico live and work in Sonoma County. Concentrated in labor-intensive sectors such as row crops and wine grapes, Indigenous migrants perform an increasing amount of the arduous labor, which contributes to the profitability and affordability of fresh fruits, vegetables, and wine. In particular, Indigenous Mexican people in Sonoma County are culturally and linguistically isolated. Many are illiterate, and some speak neither Spanish nor English, but only their native languages such as Mixteco, Triqui, Maya, and Chatino. It is important to note that Indigenous Mexican people are not Hispanic or Latino, but Indigenous. They are often homogenized with Latino communities. And just to show the differences in terms of language itself, I want to play a quick audio clip of the language Mixteco, where you can hear the difference between Spanish and Mixteco. So as you can hear from this short audio clip, that the language of Mixteco sounds nothing like a Spanish, but there's often the confusion since they are from Mexico, they're Mexican nationals, that Spanish and Indigenous Mexican languages are similar. While disaster relief efforts in Sonoma have largely been praised as effective, migrant workers were especially impacted from the fire due to the loss of employment, violations of occupational health and safety standards, the lack of evacuation information in their native languages, confusion about eligibility for disaster relief services, and poor infrastructure in housing and migrant communities. Undocumented migrant socioeconomic situation is usually precarious. However, the wildfire disaster intensified their already difficult situation. The Sonoma fires, moreover, revealed how undocumented migrants and those with seasonal work visas require special consideration in disaster planning. These individuals are often afraid to seek help and restitution during and after a wildfire for fear of deportation. Undocumented migrants are also unable to access disaster relief services because of language barriers and prohibition from accessing federal disaster assistance programs. The lack of occupational health and safety standards is of key concern as intensifying wildfires collide with harvest season each year. Undocumented farm workers are shouldering the burden of protecting Sonoma's wine grapes from smoke and ash. Fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, from wildfire smoke, which is this toxic mix of heavy metals and other chemicals from burning structures and objects, can be several times more harmful to human respiratory health than PM 2.5 from other sources, such as car exhaust. Since 2015 in Northern California, the annual mean PM 2.5 has increased as a result of extreme wildfire events, and these events have taken over as the main source of PM 2.5 exceeding instances. The harm that wildfire smoke causes to farm workers may be greater than previously thought, bolstering the argument for additional research and policies to help safeguard the most vulnerable and stigmatized populations. And to put it in context of some of the interviews that we did with some of the undocumented migrants, one Indigenous farm worker told us, "We all got sick. Our throats closed in from breathing too much smoke, and our kids couldn't go to school. We had to buy masks and medicine for our throats and some goggles because my eyes were irritated when I got home." And one farm worker, Sonoma, also told us that they would come home and literally have black saliva from inhaling and breathing in so much of that toxic smoke. Another landscaper told us, "I could not get to the homes where I worked because the streets were closed. Two of the homes I worked at were destroyed. One of my good friends was lost during the disaster. He had only been living in the area for 3 weeks before he died. I myself am a cancer survivor and the only one who provides for the family." So this last quote about the cancer survivor really amplifies and underscores that these individuals have existing health disparities in the first place and are sensitive populations. And when a disaster happens, those health disparities and other socioeconomic disparities are only amplified. And again, it creates this synergetic process with the field of public health calls a syndemic. So to close up, we need to think beyond property values. A major policy implication I want to leave you all with is for wildfire research and response, we need to think again beyond just property values. Current disaster policies render many minority and poor communities invisible. As shown in our case study, migrant communities were among the most impacted during disasters, such as wildfires. Moreover, immigration status has received little attention in disaster vulnerability mapping research. Although a large proportion of disaster studies have considered race and ethnicity as a vulnerability factor, impacts experienced by migrants require an intersectional research approach. Current disaster policies also fail to account for the complex web of impacts caused by disasters far beyond the destruction of property within the perimeter of the fire itself. For example, toxic smoke flows down from burning mountainsides, settling in densely populated valleys below, threatening outdoor workers. Lavish hillside mansions are destroyed or evacuated, leaving low-wage migrant gardeners, housekeepers, and caregivers unemployed. Tourism throughout the region shuts down, putting thousands of hotel employees out of work. From the loss of housing and infrastructure to the closure of schools and job sites, multiple regions are impacted beyond the footprint of the actual fire. For example, a low-income family living outside a burn area who loses several weeks of wages without eligibility for assistance may be more negatively impacted than a higher income homeowner who lives within the fire risk zone whose property is replaced by their homeowner's insurance policy, which also pays for hotel accommodations for them to stay in the interim. And to really conclude on this picture here, this is of the Thomas Fire in Ventura County. It shows a little girl wearing an N95 mask. And I think because of COVID-19 pandemic, we all kind of have become desensitized to pictures like of little kids with N95 masks. But if you'll note the date down there, it says 2017. So this really highlights how these populations have been living with a disproportionate impacts of multiple types of hazards and disasters for multiple years than the general population. So just to conclude, if we really want to tackle disaster risk reduction, it starts with the social integration of migrants before disaster, including them in our social safety net and labor protections as well. Acknowledging that this population has existing inequalities that are only exacerbated during a disaster. So, and I could talk a little bit more about the recommendations and final implications of this, but I want to leave enough time for Q&A and hand it over to Davin. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Davin, go for it.
Great. Thank you, Michael. That was great. That was great context setting. And of course, some of the research that Mike has done has been really critical in us bringing up our campaign here in the North Bay. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the campaign that puts into context the fires that Michael's been referring to. And you know, I really been thinking about it. We've been talking about it as very much like a place-based campaign and a model of organizing that's adapting itself to material conditions on the ground. And, you know, what we say is that climate change changes everything and should definitely change the way we even do this work, the way we engage in strategy, the way we engage in leadership development, the way we engage in what we're pushing for in terms of policy, should all take into account this looming reality of climate change and its impact on the ground and on how people live their lives. You know, Michael was referring to the fires since 2017 into 2020, and after like 3 major fires in 4 years in 2021, workers started actually organizing. We started organizing with farm workers, indigenous farm workers in their majority, and they started not only to be trained as organizers, but to survey one another, to survey their family members, to survey their co-workers, asking what was the greatest, most pressing needs in times of wildfires. And many of our leaders had worked directly in the smoke, sometimes directly in actual evacuation zones. And I want to refer to evacuation zones because it's a really interesting moment where evacuation zones, everybody's going out, right? You know, everybody's leaving, but there's a group of workers going in, right? Workers are being placed into evacuation zones to salvage the crops of the richest people in the county. And so a lot of the policy work we've been talking about focuses on these evacuation zones. But so our leadership knew the reality. You know, one of our core leaders, a Mixteca leader named Margarita, she was working at 2 a.m. when the fires were happening. She lost her home to the fires, and also she didn't know what was happening with her daughters or her husband while she was working in the field. So the reality was real, and the push, the impetus to organize was clear and present. And so they began developing a set of demands from that. But I think part of it, when we talk about a place-based campaign, is that we're trying to listen deeply to what the land is telling us and listen deeply to what the workers are telling us. And it's not just about policy shifts, but it's also, this is a moment where we can actually challenge an economy of extraction here in what's commonly referred to as a wine country. Now it's more so referred to as fire country, or we would also refer to it as worker country. But this is actually a moment we have in our midst to actually shift and challenge an industry that extracts wealth from the land, extracts wealth from workers, and has gone unchallenged for the last 30 years, since at least the United Farm Workers were stronger in the 80s and 90s, but haven't been as strong in the last few decades. This industry has gone untouched and unchallenged. So this is actually a moment for workers to start building power. And I also want to say that, like, having an active campaign on the ground happening in real time is not about only policy, right? I always say that policy is secondary to power. It's actually our ability to build power amongst workers, and we can measure our power by how many people we have involved in the struggle and how many and our material conditions on the ground shifting, so that it's not just like, okay, well, we feel powerful, but rather, are there material shifts in people's lives and people's pocketbooks? And did we start with the core, and now we have a much larger group of people that are fighting with us? Because in absence of wealth and resources, you have to organize people. That's the only way to wage power in the social sphere. So we've been wrestling with this, and we also think that a campaign that's worth its weight in salt is not only about is about developing leaders who have followers and people who are taking risks and starting to challenge dominant paradigms. And a campaign is also about shifting narratives and not only just telling new stories, but one thing we've found really interesting in our work is that we're starting to tell old stories, right? We're starting to talk with, because our base is composed of indigenous workers, we're starting to have really incredible conversations about crop tending, right? How did people revere water when they were growing up? How did they revere the seeds that they were planting? How did they pray over crops? How were they tuning themselves into weather patterns, listening to the land, speaking their mother tongue? As Michael referred to, these are languages that have been passed on orally. They are not written down anywhere. They've been passed from generation to generation. So in the midst of the campaign where we're fighting for social change, we're fighting around policy, we're also beginning to reframe who's doing the work. The fact that we're so privileged to have farm workers in our midst who have carried on languages for centuries, and they're still speaking them in the fields that we work in, and who have an incredible knowledge of around the land, around climate change. They've been paying attention to the land for centuries. Right. And so, we've been actually wrestling with the idea, and it's a difficult shift, but we've been trying to refer to what's commonly referred to as farm workers as farmers, because as far as I can understand, the only difference between a farm worker and a farmer is property ownership. Right. But we're working with farmers, right? These are generational, multi-generational farmers, people who have worked the land for the majority of their lives and are now thrown into the midst of an industry that's exploitative, extractive, and is all about the hustle and the speed with which you're able to salvage crops and make other people wealthier beyond their wildest dreams. So I think part of the beauty of the campaign has been actually telling these old stories in a public sphere, having workers speak to their knowledge of the land, their knowledge of water, their practices they've been practicing since they were babies, and that they're passing on to their children, and the languages that they're still holding on to and preserving in the midst of this culture that we live in here. And then another piece of the campaign that I think we found important is that trying to put a public eye and a public narrative on the extractive nature of the wine industry, not only in terms of workers' wages, but the impacts that the wine industry has on the land and has on the waterways. To some extent, I feel like we give the wine industry an out when we only speak to the drought that we're living here on the West Coast, especially in Northern California. We're in the midst of one of the most severe droughts in the last 1,000 years. And when we say, the waters, we're low on water, that we're in a drought, we actually let the industry off the hook in terms of their water usage and how they're actually draining our waterways to preserve this luxury crop. And so a lot of the research that we've been able, and thanks to Michael and thanks to some of my coworkers as well, we've actually been able to put a public eye on the use of glyphosates in the crops and what they're putting into the land, the use of water, but also the way that some of the largest wineries and the industry as a whole has been exploiting workers. And I think a focus on the industry has also made it so that there's something the public is reacting to, and it actually makes a clear line and definition between the workers and the industry who is exploiting them. And it's made for a very interesting campaign here in the North Bay, where the industry is actually spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight workers and to fight the campaign that we're undergoing. And I think sometimes having clear lines drawn actually makes for it's helped us significantly in the sense that anytime the wine industry comes and attacks us, more workers come into our fold. And so it's been a really interesting impact, I think, for them negatively, and challenging workers face to face often. And in terms of coverage, I think what we've been hoping and trying to push is that we're not trying to focus on workers in their victimhood or the harm that's been done to them, but rather seeing them as agents of their own change. Their ability to have emotion, feel pain, understand the material reality. What does that feel like? And then what are you going to do about it? And the worker core that we started with, which was a core team of 7, we called it the Equipo. They've built a structure where, we just got out of a meeting on last Sunday where we had 130 workers organized in the park. We've done actions of 250 workers directly on wineries. We have reached to about 1,500 workers through our text messaging system. And so they've built a structure where they're constantly in conversations with their co-workers, organizing. They've assumed the responsibility to shift their reality and the reality of the industry and the reality of the industry that impacts their family. And I think that's what we've tried to focus on, is that this is about people stepping into their own agency, and organizing with others to actually have real power in their own lives. And to some extent, we've wanted to focus away from not only like what is the policy solution, because that's often put to us, but rather that workers are building actual power. So policy is beginning to shift, but I think the actual story is that there's a body of workers challenging the wealthiest industry in the North Bay for the first time in 30, 40 years. There's actually enough power, and I won't say we have enough power, but there's a power base at play that's beginning to force shifts at the policy level in terms of the county and in terms of certain wineries. I'll list a couple of those policies, but I think what the story is that there's actual power being built from an agrarian base in the North Bay, from a farm worker base, and this has not been seen in a serious way in the last 30 to 40 years. So quickly, the county just passed a policy that prohibits workers from working in evac zones during fires, which is incredible. That the wine industry is furious, but the county has actually made policy workers cannot enter to work in evacuation zones. The county has also created a $3 million fund for unemployment compensation, which was one of our key demands, is if workers can't work or don't want to work in evacuation zones, they still need to be compensated, because you can't just say like nobody gets in, because workers rely on the harvest. It's the most important part of the year economically for workers. So how are they going to be compensated? We said the grapes are insured and workers are not. So what happens when workers are out of work? In the county, we think the industry should step in to pay these compensations, but as a stopgap, the county has put $3 million forward. And in the policy that the county created, they've guaranteed the right to Indigenous language access in evacuation zones should workers demand it. So this is the first time that we know of in a government policy where they have guaranteed that if workers only speak Chatino or speak Mixteco, as Michael was referring to, and they need whatever emergency plan is being spoken to them, they need that translated into Indigenous languages, they have the right to demand that from their mayordomo, from their supervisor, from their boss. And the policy also created security and assurance of clean water and clean bathrooms in evacuation zones, which was also a key demand of the workers. And then outside of the government, 2 wineries have actually stepped into our key demand, which is out of hazard pay. That if a worker is working in a hazardous situation, like the pictures you saw where there's smoke on the hillside, workers are harvesting crops, if they're forced to work in that situation, then they need to be paid at least time and a half. And so Gallo Wineries is the second largest winery in Sonoma County. They are also under a contract with the UFW. They're in the UFW, United Farm Workers, has a contract there. And in the union contract, for the first time, our demand was put in, which is that of hazard pay. If a worker is working in conditions that are 150 AQI, where the air is pretty nasty, they need to be paid time and a half. And that's the first time, to our knowledge, that climate-induced policy is being put into union contracts, especially with farmers, with workers. And then another farm, a small biodynamic farm called Ecoterreno, also just built a relationship with us and also signed on to the demand to provide workers with hazard pay if they're working in hazardous conditions. And of course, if workers don't want to work in hazardous conditions, can't work, that they would still be compensated economically. And so it's very interesting that some of the more organic and biodynamic farm ranches, wineries, are beginning to engage with us, while the industry as a whole is putting up humongous barriers. And like I said, they've paid a PR firm hundreds of thousands of dollars to actually challenge us. They've paid workers to attend government meetings against us, which are comical at best. And every time they pay workers to come challenge us at government meetings, the workers end up calling us, and we have a whole underground network of workers that are passing us information on the down low, which is beautiful. But also the wine industry as a whole, the Grape Growers Commission, it's an industry that's based on PR. It's an industry that plays itself to the desires of folks to come have a beautiful getaway in wine country, and they have a pretty robust greenwashing campaign. They've created their own sustainable label, and for the actual organic growers and the biodynamic growers, they're like, there's nothing to be said about the sustainability of these crops. There's no way you could spend $188 gallons of water that goes into producing one bottle of wine and call that sustainable. So they've built up a PR machine that we consider to be greenwashing, and so it's interesting that some of the folks that are actually trying to use regenerative practices are beginning to engage with us on protecting workers, which I think is a really important shift. I'm gonna leave it at that because I feel like I've probably talked a little bit over my time. And we can open it up for questions. And I'll drop a link of our Instagram page where we're trying to, like I said, we're trying to tell good stories. We're trying to tell better stories, not only of what the workers are fighting for, but where folks are coming from. And I think we've got some good press up to this point. But yeah, we're trying to talk about workers standing in their power.
All right. Thanks, Davin. And thanks, Mike. So folks, you know the drill. Let me know if you have a question and we'll start Q&A. And while I wait for one to come in, I'll ask Davin, so are you a beer drinker then? Do you avoid the wine?
I have avoided the wine by default to some extent. It's hard to do it to drink around here, but again, some of the wineries that have signed on have been like, hey, you want to try this? And so they'll pass us bottles every now and then, and so it feels like it's more just wine.
All right. Osha, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Davin and Michael. This question is for both of you, or either of you. I live in Arizona, in Phoenix, and I'm wondering if you have information or how the issues that you've talked about in your area in California apply to southwestern Arizona, where around Yuma, where there are huge lettuce fields, things like that, and a large population of undocumented people in Arizona is notorious for how its treatment of undocumented workers. But also in Phoenix, where I live, there's a large number of undocumented people working on landscaping, and the heat here in the summer, can be outrageous, and do you work with issues like that? Do you know people who do, or anything that you have to say on that? I'd appreciate. Thank
Sure, you know, we expand on the compounding of disasters, understanding, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that wildfires disasters don't happen in isolation. They often compound with other hazards and comorbidities, you know, from heat waves to drought. And we saw during the wildfires in 2020 and even in some of the smaller fires in 2021 that these massive heat waves were occurring. In the work that we're doing with NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, we're also identifying how does that intensity of particulate matter from wildfire smoke intensifies with heat as well. And in terms of Arizona, yes, obviously California, Northern California is even different from Central Coast, where I did my other research on Santa Barbara and Ventura County, even if it's the same state. You know, so obviously the context will be different in Arizona and Nevada and New Mexico, where these wildfires are happening, but there are lessons that we can learn, particularly on anti-immigrant sentiment and racial discrimination based on their indigeneity or because they're Latino. We saw in Arizona a couple of years ago when the wildfires were occurring. I believe back then it was Senator McCain and a couple others that were soliciting GAO reports at the federal level. The governmental agency of oversight, I can't remember the name, GAO, and they did a report to identify if undocumented migrants, particularly those crossing the border, were starting the massive wildfires that were happening in the 2010s. We saw a similar situation happen in Sonoma County, and Davin could mention that. I think it might have been 2017, where individuals were blaming undocumented migrants for the massive wildfires occurring in Sonoma County. That was a little bit different. You had the sheriff thankfully come out and totally debunk those allegations. But we do see that a lot of the lack of disaster preparedness are political choices. Many of these communities from there, from California to Arizona to Texas and New Mexico have been living in these regions for generation, and politicians are intentionally making political choices that are withholding some of these disaster resources.
And I think just the other piece that I think I didn't mention, the other way we're trying to respond to the extractive industry as a whole, and the same extraction that might be happening across the Southwest and obviously across the country, is that we're also trying to put workers into a new industry, which is this disaster preparedness industry. We've actually been starting to run work crews because there's millions of dollars coming into Sonoma County right now to do fire prevention work, right? And for the most part, that's being held by contractors who are subcontracting to subcontractors, and what gets down to the workers is actually very meager in terms of wages. And we've actually figured out, we've built a partnership with Resilience Force out of New Orleans, out of the Gulf Coast, who have been tracking disasters and trying to organize folks in Florida as we speak around the hurricanes. But we can actually get contracts and put our own people to work doing regenerative landscaping, regenerative work to actually prepare fires. We're actually going to run the first Spanish-based controlled burn training in the country, as far as we know, in December, teaching workers how to use fires. Many workers have been using fires, like I said, since they were children, or where they're coming from. But we can't just fight the bad. We actually have to build the good. And I think that's the other part of the campaign. We're not just here to go after an industry. We actually have to provide alternatives and provide a new way for people to make a living while they take care of the planet, while they take care of the land. You know, we refer to the workers as earth workers, because that's what they know, that what they've always done. And now we could actually pay them healthy wages, double what they'd be making in grapes, to do this work that's slow paced, that doesn't rely on somebody, you know, screaming and yelling at you all day, degrading you, but could actually be done in a process without the traditional structures that they're coming from in the grapes. So we're hoping to offer alternatives so that we're not just subservient to the current industry that's prevalent in this region. And I imagine there might be alternative industries where in Arizona as well, or other places.
All right, thank you both. Sporty had a question.
Hello. I was just curious to know if the exploitative practices that the two of you mentioned, is it specific to the wine industry in California, or is it across other agricultural sectors as well? Or is the money that's in the wine industry kind of making it more pronounced there?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Yeah, I was just wondering if the exploitative, practices that you mentioned and the kind of hazards wildfires, kind of subject migrant workers to, is that very specific to the wine industry in California, or is it across the agricultural industry there? Or is it the money that's in the industry kind of making these more pronounced for the migrant workers?
David can talk about this, but having worked in the Central Coast on different crops, those are luxury, other types of luxury crops like fruits and particularly berries. The situation is different, but there is the same exploitative practices. One issue that compounds and comparing these two research sites have been that the berry picking largely happens out during the day. And many of the residents actually often can see them. And versus wine industry, and Devin could talk a little bit more about this, the wine picking actually occurs at night. So away from the view of residents and increasing that visibility and sort of the disparate impacts. But in general, these impacts are largely because of the exclusion of this population and our integration in government programs, and you fully allowing them to be part of our society. But Davin, of course, could talk more about the exploitative practices.
Yeah, the one thing I'd say is that the interesting thing that happens is the pisca, or the harvest season of the grapes, coincides directly here with the fire season. So it's been this perfect storm. It's a very short window, actually. The harvest is about a 6-week period. And the years that we've had fire since 2017 has coincided directly with that window. So it's, on the one hand, it's a moment where workers are needing to work. Again, this is the main economic moment for workers to make a living in the year. And now they're being forced to work, or they're forcing themselves to work because they need to make the money. But it also it provides a very interesting juxtaposition where it's also the moment where workers have the most power in terms of withholding their labor. Right. This is actually the moment where workers are needed most, which provides a very interesting moment for organizing in terms of what happens going forward too. But I think that's one of the more unique aspects of what's happening here in the wine country, that it coincides directly with fire season.
Thank you.
All right, Ashley, you're up next.
Yeah, thank you all so much. So I do some reporting in Washington, and we have a very small set of vineyards on the eastern side of the state, as well as other ag. And I know, like, for the first time in the last few years, valley fever has started to become an issue up here. And so I'm wondering if you've seen climate change exacerbate for your communities as kind of airborne or vector-borne illnesses, and what that's been like for y'all.
Was that valley fever?
Valley
Yes.
fever.
Yes.
I'm not
Fungus
familiar.
spores. I don't know, Devin, have you heard much? But in the Central Valley, that's where most of we hear about valley fever, obviously affecting farm workers, also incarcerated population, because there's a lot of prisons in the Central Valley or the San Joaquin Valley. And with the increasing drought, that means the spores from the ground where the fungus is, I believe it's fungus, right? Because it's so dry, they're being blown away, and people are reading them more often. But on the central coast and north coast, I haven't heard too much about valley fever, but it's mostly in the San Joaquin Valley, affecting outdoor workers and incarcerated populations.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, actually, I don't have too much information on that.
No, it's okay. Thank you.
All right, Dorian. Are you down there somewhere? You were next.
Hi, Michael, this question is for you, but Devin, if you have any thoughts on it as well. I'm hoping you can elaborate on the idea of slow violence and other ways you're seeing it affect undocumented and other marginalized communities across California that the media might be undercovering.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. I should read my article. I put it in the chat. I mentioned slow violence. This idea of slow violence is, we think of disasters. We think of when we think of disaster, we often think of catastrophic disasters, earthquakes, and Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina that are spectacular. We can see them, they're visceral, they grab people's attention. It's like a car accident that you have to look at. Slow violence really refers to that kind of everyday injustices that are occurring from things like climate change. They're small, little that you can't really see. They're not spectacular, but have a toll and a cumulative burden on people's bodies and well-being and psyche. So that could be increasing heat. That could be additional air quality from our worsening air quality from our warming planet that happens slowly but surely, but cumulatively it adds to the disproportionate impact that individuals are having. So slow violence really underscores these invisible, slow-moving types of violence that are not spectacular or catastrophic, but add up and disproportionately are affecting low-income people of color, African Americans, Latino, Indigenous folks, and that also is intersectional. So that's how we kind of see it. Yes, the wildfires are spectacular, especially extreme ones, but it's adding to existing disparities that these individuals are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. That can also be quite violent.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd probably say is just the flip side to that being that people actually have to experience what power feels like to dissuade themselves, because there is this slow process. Wages remain stagnant as wine has gone up, and people feel these things happening to them, the drought, fires, but also one thing that we hope is happening is that people didn't know they could challenge their bosses. They didn't know they could challenge the ranchers. And so for the first time, they're taking risks. And, we did an action recently where we took about 30 workers, a live Mexican banda. They got all their gear out, and we went up to a Sonoma wine music festival at a particular winery that had been not signing on to the agreements. And the beauty of the action, though, was the fact that workers went from this feeling of nervousness, because they're like, holy cow, we're getting out of our cars and we're going past the police to the front gates of this huge wine festival. And that nervousness was probably the most liberating thing, because it turned into joy, right? It turned into dancing and flying, but workers having to actually wrestle and take risks. And I'm not just saying for workers, for me, for us in terms of our own human development, like that process of risk taking, of feeling the nerves and that turning into collective joy and doing it with other humans in a joyful way is, I think, the other way we're also trying to fight against these emotions that push us into to sitting it out or to accepting our realities, right? And so I think part of this, like what Michael's referring to, like the integration of immigrant communities into general society too, it's also about, any good campaign worth its weight in salt is about this human development aspect too, because we're fighting this process, this impending situation that's on us from social factors, economic factors, and we have to combat it with these social factors. The only thing we know how to do, which is collective action, collective work. And so I think part of the experience is like workers having to deal with that fear and then go through it to fight off the rest of it.
No, definitely, and I'm glad you brought up that issue of power building and really how folks are able to respond and not just be resilient to bounce back, but bounce better and really question some of these structural systemic inequalities that caused these inequitable disparate disaster impacts. Because it's our system, our infrastructure, our withholding of resources that are creating these disparate impacts. And inequalities, and the work that Davin and others are doing at Power Building is really shifting that. And in the research that we've seen, coming from 2017 through the COVID-19 pandemic, these wildfires, it's unfortunate that it happened to undocumented migrant communities, farm workers communities in particular. But as Davin was mentioned, it created this form of organizing, collective power, and these organizations became de facto disaster experts and mutual aid organizations, not because they wanted to, but because they were forced. They were the stopgap measures for governments because these governments did not plan or provide any resources, particularly in 2017. So these groups started talking to each other throughout the state, from Sonoma County, creating the first in-nation undocumented fund for undocumented migrants, providing now over, I believe, $10 million for disaster aid for individuals that are ineligible for federal disaster aid. They started talking to folks in Ventura and Santa Barbara County and really created this collective mutual aid disaster infrastructure. So when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, it of course disproportionately affected farm worker communities. But in my interviews and talking to advocates, they all acknowledge those since 2017, those 3 years prior to the pandemic hitting, created that disaster mutual aid infrastructure in the state. And had it not been for those extreme wildfire events, the farm worker community, migrant community would have been far worse off during that COVID-19 pandemic. So again, that collective power building infrastructure in 2017, 2018, and 2019 led up to a little bit better response in migrant and farm worker communities when COVID hit.
All right, thanks to both of you. Melissa, you had a question.
Yes, hi. I would like to find out, how do you see this reshaping the face of agriculture, not only in the US, but globally? For example, in my part of the world, we have high import bills because of how smaller spaces are. While we, of course, grow our own food, etc., we still import largely from spaces like North America, etc. So how do you see this affecting that trade, as well as Davin spoke to the reframing of agriculture and how it is looked at, and he used a wonderful phrase, earth workers. So how do you see this as well reshaping the US's response and the corporation's response to how agriculture is ultimately seen?
Michael, you want to give it a shot?
I think climate change in general, and I think Davin could talk a little bit more to the labor practices that his 5 for 5 campaign is changing. But let's take it at a larger scale. Climate change is disrupting the agricultural community and industry, really affecting their profits, the way that the availability of fresh fruits and vegetables, and wine itself. As I mentioned, that wine taint, $3.7 billion were lost in wine because of that taint. You see farm owners putting sunscreen on grapes to protect it from the heat. And then because of the drought, we see different crops being grown. We see different more water efficient practices of irrigation being utilized by farmers that never wanted to do that. At the same time, because of climate change, we're seeing new nature-based solutions in terms of pesticide use and carbon sequestration that environmental justice groups and labor migrant rights organizations are pushing forward, teaming up with traditional environmentalists to ask for alternative approaches that address carbon emissions reduction, pollution reduction, and most importantly, pollution reduction that's impacting farm worker communities. So we see this this kind of synergetic, multi-benefit, multi-use type of climate change policy that is looking to make our farming industry more resilient, but also having that equity aspect, again, of how can we provide more practices that, again, are not only just reducing carbon pollution, but also improving the lives and health, environmental and occupational health of farmer communities.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And I think the only other thing I'd say is that, like, without water here in this region, there won't be grapes, right? And I don't see the wine industry locally having a terribly long shelf life. I mean, maybe give it 15, 20 years, but without water, there's nothing. And so how people adapt, and you know, the industry wouldn't say this, right? They understand that with lack of water, it's going to be very difficult for them, but that's not a very good PR move. And so I think, you know, we work with a group in the Bay Area that talks about, like, transition is inevitable, but justice is not. Right. So what kind of transitions will our economy make? Will local growers make? Will our local food system make? It's really going to rely on folks on the ground trying to create new solutions, listening to workers. But there will be transitions in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And it'll really be up to us to make sure what kind of transitions those are. But I don't see this industry having a terribly long shelf life, given how climate change is impacting the region.
All right, Maher, you had a question.
Yeah, I just had a really quick question or thought bubble, if you will. But when I was living in New York, and I'm sure California has something similar, and I wanted to ask both of you, but when I was living in New York, there was this publication named Documented. They still do some excellent work. And a part of the work that they do focuses on reporting for migrant communities and especially those that are undocumented, and telling their stories, and also giving them information for things that they can do. Did you both come across that during your work with workers in California? Do they have access to a news source or something that directly serves them and provides them with the kind of information they need to, you know, educate themselves about the issues taking place in their language? Or is that a gap that you see there? Does that exist? Has it been useful, instrumental, or does that not exist? I was just wondering.
Yeah, to some extent, there's more bilingual and Spanish-based publications now in this region than there was 10, 15, 20 years ago. We created our own publication, and we always try to work it through the organizing structure so that workers are using it as a tool to get into people's houses, have conversations. We've created some zines. But there's definitely, you know, there's the first bilingual radio station here in Sonoma County in the country that was established in the 60s, that still, especially during disasters, is a source for constant information. And then I think just through social media, you know, like with workers, definitely more Facebook than Instagram. But we're, you know, I think there's a lot of places people are going for information. Definitely more so than there was 10 to 15 years ago. And there's a couple Spanish-based publications that we talk to constantly, that we know that workers are tuned into.
Oh,
Michael,
sorry.
Oh.
Yes,
Yeah.
I would add, I think the work that that some of these labor and migrant and environmental justice groups are doing to get the word out. I only know about newsletters through these organizations, and they were key in terms of language justice, particularly in places like Ventura and Santa Barbara County. When the Thomas Fire hit in 2017, everyone thinks California, there's this Latinization of California, and all governments are welcoming to Spanish language translations and interpretation. But that's not the case there. They did not have one person to do live translations or interpretations of emergency response information. And this went on for 10 whole days. At one point, they had a Google Translate button there, reading, if you can't translate this, please take it to somebody that can translate it for you, or use the translate button. And back in 2017, we know that Google Translate was not that great. It was translating words like a wildfire to hairbrush in Spanish. So these groups had to, use social media, as Davin talked about, WhatsApp, text messaging, Facebook, their low power wattage radio station in Spanish, and a couple other indigenous languages to get this information out. So again, unfortunately, for 10 whole days, that did not occur. That fire lasted a month. And translations and interpretation did not occur until the state, since there was pressure from local Latino elected officials to Sacramento, and Sacramento Office of Emergency Services lent someone that could do those translations.
Thank you both so much. That really helped illuminate a coverage gap, perhaps, that Spanish-speaking journalists could fill.
All right, Christine, you had a question.
Continuing the same conversation about how to reach people, especially, farm workers and others who, journalism is in flux anyway. I mean, are you finding that new social media approaches are working better for you? And also, things like Teatro Campesino from, years ago, decades ago, and how important that was in sharing information. Do you see the internet filling any of these roles in any unique ways, or is there more need for that? If you could talk to us a little bit more about how to reach people who don't speak English possibly, and people who are in vulnerable situations that don't have, are only accessing news on their phone.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's interesting because, our campaign started in 2021, and we really made it a point to be in person with folks, just because Zoom wasn't the most accessible, and also didn't give the depth of relationship needed to actually pull off a campaign or get a campaign off the ground. And also, I think what we're hoping that our organizing model can do is actually deepen relationships to the point where workers are seeing themselves as a collective, and we're avoiding some of the more transactional relationships that can come about when there's only an action, so we don't we haven't been so much about putting flyers out, everybody come to this meeting, right? And to some extent in the organizing, we're trying to pull off what they call structure tests, where we're able to understand the depth of the relationships that our workers have with other workers to see if they can get them to activate into any social process. So the meeting we had this last Sunday, we had a goal of 100 workers, 130 showed up, but we didn't market it to the public. We wanted to see, could workers pull this off using their basic relationships? We did a month of house meetings in advance of it. And with the idea being that the people participating in house meetings would then come to a meeting in the park, and they did. And so we're always trying to make sure that, to a large extent, we know if it's 100 people, if it's 200 people, that we know who's coming around us. And in that way, we're able to do a lot of follow-up. We're able to deepen that base. So there's a place, I think, for social media in terms of promotion of events and such. I to some extent, we've shied away just because we want the depth of relationship that comes with one-on-ones, that comes with house meetings, that comes with smaller group meetings. And the other part of it is that workers are starting to hear more and more about us. So they're reaching out to us in terms of wage recovery. That we've recovered $60,000 in wages in the last year and a half, because workers are talking to workers. And then some workers stand out more than others. People know them, oh, that person is kind of involved with this thing. They'll talk to that person. They'll reach out to us. So I think there's a place for it for sure. but we've tried to be an in-person presence, as opposed to like an online resource or even Zoom for that matter. We've tried to really make sure that we're reaching folks on an individual level in person when we can. And I think avoiding kind of the Zoom organizing has been a reason why we've had success from the start.
But I also like to add the great work, important work that many of you on this workshop do for highlighting these stories to the larger general public, specifically policymakers. Your human-centered reports on this, putting a face to the inequalities to many of these communities that are rendered invisible. The news media, from community local papers to even business journals, to national publications and TV and media and radio have been key and instrumental in this work and highlighting these issues, and that has played a significant role in both places that I have worked for. And I'd like to thank you all for that work that you do as well.
Thank you. Mara had a question.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm thinking about, I can't remember which of you said it, but the phrase de facto disaster experts. Something I think a lot about in New Hampshire is how many of our emergency services, particularly emergency housing, are becoming more needed as the climate changes, but are already falling short in terms of like not doing what they're supposed to do baseline. So I'm wondering if there's other disasters, whether they're emergent or sort of slow violence that you were talking about, Michael, that you're thinking this like de facto disaster expertise can be applied to, or any lessons from watching this play out over the past few years that you wish government officials would sort of take away and consider in their work.
Here's one of the slides that I was going to show, but I wanted to make sure we had enough time, really just highlighting that we need more diverse disaster leadership. This came out in the Scientific American with a congressional oversight hearing on disaster management, where Curtis Brown, he was one of the directors in Virginia, that literally told Congress that disaster management is too white and too male, and it's not representative of the vast majority of individuals that are disproportionately experiencing disasters. So first and foremost, I think there's a need to acknowledgement our infrastructure from the federal government to our local and county, our state and county level managers are not reflective of the individuals that are disproportionately impacted by disasters. And that's quite important that we understand we have individuals that are culturally and linguistically competent and understand the contextual natures that are happening in these communities. I was at one doing a briefing to the governor's office of emergency services, and one of the senior leadership literally said, I had no idea there were so many indigenous farm workers, and was quite surprised the disproportionate impact happening to this population during the wildfires. So I think first and foremost, we need that, but that's why these de facto experts are emerging. And they should have been experts in the first place and brought to the table when the county, the VODAD systems or the disaster roundtables that they're having on disaster preparedness happens. But again, that is not the case. And because government isn't doing that, yes, these individuals are become de facto disaster experts or disaster managers. But I don't know if I covered entirely your question. I might have got a little lost there.
No, that was super helpful. Just like also any other, because I feel like we've been learning a lot in this training about how interconnected a ton of these environmental injustices are. And so if there's other ones that you feel like this de facto expertise could be applied to, I'd also be curious about that.
And other types of disasters, that is?
Mm-hmm. Or like ones that are overlapping with wildfire.
Heat waves, obviously, drought, hazardous air quality. Those are probably the most prevalent, at least from the California perspective. I think Devin had something to say.
Yeah, I think just drought and water usage. I mean, we literally know the workers who are turning on and off the the switches to water in the fields, but also I think another industry tied to disasters that's highly exploited is disaster cleanups. And we're barely beginning to understand it ourselves, but what happens, who's doing the cleanup work, how these contracts are getting held, how workers are getting paid, the equipment in the terribly dangerous conditions and materials that workers are having to clean up after wildfires in this case. But I think disaster cleanup is another industry nationally with the rise of climate disaster, how workers are contracted, exploited post-disaster. Like we said, we have a partnership with Resilience Force out of the Gulf Coast that are kind of storm chasers to some extent, because what happens after each disaster, and the same here in wildfire country. I think it's ripe for exploitation, but it's also ripe for organizing at the same time.
All right, thank you guys. Folks, we have time for another question, or we can have a little longer break than the last one since timing got all askew. Either way, while you're thinking, let's thank our speakers. Mike and Davin, thanks so much for being here. There's your round of applause. And we truly appreciate your time and the work both of you do in helping us tell these stories and learn more about these issues. You should be warned that everyone here has your contact info, so you'll probably hear from some of them in the not too distant future. And feel free to send me anything you think might be useful, or story ideas that you think our journalists should know more about, and I'll be happy to pass that on.
Great, and I will say really quickly, I'm sitting in for my coworker Davida, who does all our comms work and is always in communication with journalists across the country and internationally and doing an amazing job. And so I wanted to give a shout out to Davida, and if you ever do contact us, you might be in contact with them. But I'm sitting in today for them, who are amazing, doing an amazing job.
Cool, and I'll make sure that are included in that list of contacts. So
cool, thanks.
Well, thank you again. It was such a pleasure to share this important work that Devin and I have the privilege to work with workers on the front lines of climate change. So thank you for this opportunity.